We've got 10 propositions on our California ballot for November 2024. It's a lot, but I'm here to help you do your civic duty by providing you breakdowns of every proposition. What is it doing? Who's behind it? What red flags are there? And at the end, I'll briefly give my opinion about what I'm probably going to do and what I think the calculus is for how you should decide whether or not to support it. As you may have noticed, I've put chapters in the video below, so you can skip through the propositions that you're concerned about, if there's certain ones that you're not worried about, you've already decided on, or if you are watching a segment and you kind of get the gist of it and you want to move on to the next section. I'm hoping you'll watch it through most of the way, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. But hey, I use YouTube myself, and sometimes you're done with something, you're ready to move on to the next section. So I wanted to enable you to do that. Before the segments on each proposition, I have a few initial segments I want to share with you about the California proposition process in general. First, I want to go over just how we come to have propositions, how they get onto our ballot. Second, I want to talk a bit about the California bonds and how those work so you can have a good understanding and baseline to understand what we're going to be talking about when I get to those specific propositions, 2 and 4, for this particular ballot. And third, I want to give you some general guidelines about how you should look at evaluating California propositions in general, not just this year, but every year. All right, let's talk briefly about the California proposition system, specifically how propositions get onto ballots. Now, there are basically two ways. First, the legislature can pass legislation that triggers a proposition being put onto the ballot. Sometimes it's required by law, such as the case of tax increases. Other times, the legislature is specifically passing something that it knows or that triggers a proposition kind of on purpose. So sometimes it's processed, and sometimes it's done because that was the type of legislation it was. So the law can trigger automatically a proposition if taxes are raised, and the legislature knows this. But then other times, the legislature might pass a law that it's intending, they specify in it, take this to the people and let them then vote on it. It's a subtle difference, but it is, I think, a little bit different. The other way a proposition can get on the California ballot is when a person or an incorporated group or entity submits a proposition to the California government and then follows it up and goes through that. There's a whole proposition process the California government has laid out. And the main big part of it is gathering several million signatures to actually get the proposition onto the ballot. This generally costs millions of dollars to do. Even if it's something that seems obvious, it's just the volume of signatures that's required, which is more than the actual minimums because they have to be validated. So if you submit 5 million signatures to the California government, they have a process to validate the signatures via, the address and what have you. If they can't validate them, you can't use them. But of course, you've had to already take the time to get those signatures. So you have to raise or gain more signatures than are actually necessary in order to actually get over the finish line there. So it takes usually over $10 million. I think every proposition I've seen in terms of the funding is at least over $10 million just to successfully get a proposition through that process and through the signature validation. Once it gets through the full process, then it appears on our ballot. So for every proposition, I'll be letting you know if it's a legislature prompted proposition or one that was put on the ballot via the signature process. 2 of this year's propositions are bond issue authorization propositions. So I thought a good idea to go over some of the basics of how California bonds work. A bond is an issuance of debt. It is sold by the entity raising money and bought by someone else who has the needed money. They buy the bond and then they are paid back over some period of time with interest, that bond. So for example, if you have a $10,000 bond you might buy from the federal government, you get the bond back at $10,000 plus some odd thousands of dollars in interest. Just like you buy a car, you pay the car loan off, you're paying the principal, which is the amount of the loan plus interest. The same with bonds. It's just a tradable asset that represents debt. Like the United States, California can issue bonds in order to raise money, just like the federal government does. According to the Legislative Analyst's Office, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, California has $80 billion in outstanding bonds debt. It also has another $35 billion in debt that is authorized to be sold in the form of bonds, but hasn't been sold yet. California is, of course, in the process of paying off its existing bonds debt. year after year. And so California currently is paying a yearly payment of about $6 billion to maintain and pay off that $80 billion that's currently outstanding. And just to give you a good context for what that is, so the bonds are paid back out of the general fund. That's money that comes in from California taxpayers. The general fund for California, the overall general fund that the state of California pays out of, amounts to about $200 billion. So that's $6 billion that's paid every year on our loan debt is about 3% of the general fund's total expenditures for any given year. To put it another way, for every dollar you as a California citizen put into the general fund, 3 cents of it goes to pay off that $80 billion debt. Speaking of those two propositions, if Proposition 2 and Proposition 4 were both passed by the California electorate this November, that would add $900 million to that $6 billion payment. So it'd be $6.9 billion every year out of the general fund instead of $6 billion. And as I said, one would add it for 35 years, one adds their portion of it for 40 years. But for next year, instead of $6 billion, it'd be $6.9 billion. This would represent about a 15% increase in our yearly debt payment. As far as voting on the California propositions, I think there is one more piece of context I should provide you about California's budget situation. Just a few years ago, 2 years ago, California had a significant budget surplus of at least the tens of billions of dollars. What that means is California government was bringing in taxes much more than it was spending. Just 2 years later, we're running in the tens of billion dollars deficit, which means we're spending tens of billions of dollars more as a state than we're bringing in. Even though the yearly expense of these bond propositions is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, much smaller than these deficits or surpluses I was talking about, I think it's still relevant to your decision making to understand the general budget situation. If there's only one part of this video that I hope you listen to all the way through, it's this section. These are the general guidelines for considering California propositions. The first guideline is simply this. This is the general election official voter information guide. If you're registered in the state of California, you should have received a copy of this. And 90% of the information I'm talking about today is from this book. You see it's already, what do you call it, dog-eared. I got writing on the back here. I'm underlining stuff in it. It's got like the full text of some of the things. They have all kind of fiscal information. This is prepared by the Legislative Analyst Office, which is part of the California Legislature's nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor. That is to say, they're not, taking sides. They're simply saying we looked at the legislation, proposition information, the proposition as it's laid out, and this is how we think. This is the existing law. It tells you what's the current state of things. It tells you how it would change it, what it wants to do. It has like charts and stuff. It's really, really useful. The one thing is the information is kind of set apart in different places. So like they have information about that bond stuff I just went over. That's in here, but it's behind all the propositions. So you might not even know it's there until after you've read it and not understanding exactly how bonds work. That's in here. It's all in here. You get this in the mail. You take a look at this. It gives you usually a good idea. It's got the people who are for it and against it can submit. I don't know what that process is, but they submit arguments for and against and rebuttals to the argument for, and there's a whole process there. So you see that in there. You see if it's there or not there too. So sometimes there are a few propositions there's no argument against that was submitted. That tells you how much they aren't in the radar of kind of the powerful politicos of California. But this is the first guideline is just, this is your source. This is very, very useful. And, as soon as I get it in the mail, it's online first. You can actually I got it in the mail about maybe a week and a half ago or something. It was online like late September. So you can be in late September already be checking this stuff out. This is, ready, at least a month before the election. So that's the first guideline, is be aware of this. And you may not be getting it, or you may not realize, you may think it's that other one that just has what's on the ballot. It doesn't. It's got all kind of information. You got, the summary at the top, and then you go into the background, what the proposal is, all that stuff. So incredibly valuable. That's the first guideline. The second guideline is a simple one. I almost put it first, but I wanted to put the voter guide first. And that is, if you're not sure about a proposition, just vote no. Our government, the governor, the legislature, they're elected to run the California government. We shouldn't, the propositions are kind of, I wouldn't say they're not extraneous now because there's certain things that are required to go through the proposition process. The legislature wants some of those. But you shouldn't ever feel like an obligation to vote yes on a proposition. There are things that if you think they're a good idea, vote for them. If you're not sure or if you're against them, then you vote no. Guideline number 3, and it's a related one, is if it's a proposition that was put on the ballot via a private entity in the signature process, be more skeptical because that proposition hasn't been vetted really by anyone. For example, there was that proposition, I think 4 years ago, I actually did videos about them. Had to do with Uber and Lyft and independent contractors. Well, that's been stuck in courts for 4 years because of how it was written. Because the only people who looked at it, the only people who were involved in its writing was the private organizations that came up with it. Never mind the propositions that are a single person puts on the ballot with their wealth. There's one of those on this ballot. So those you got to be very careful about whether or not they make sense and are a good idea. Because, and if you have any kind of big red flags, probably should vote no, because those really aren't necessary. Those are just somebody or some group decided they want to change California law or change the California Constitution, which is what that one in 2020 did. And we should be very hesitant to do that if it's coming from a private group or a private person spending millions of dollars to do that. Generally not out of the goodness of their heart. Sometimes it can be a good idea, but be skeptical. And finally, the fourth guideline, which is when it's a legislatively prompted proposition, look at the vote in the legislature that got it onto the ballot. Was it purely along partisan lines? Were there any no's? A lot of the propositions in this year in California got Republican votes. I mean, the legislature is obviously dominated by Democrats. I think they have a supermajority. But there are like 20-30% Republicans, so maybe even 40% Republicans. I believe it's like something 20-something Republicans between the House and the lower and higher houses in the California legislature. So there are a fair number of them. And one or two of these propositions, they all voted against it. Some of the other ones, they didn't. And so I think that can kind of give you a clue about how controversial a proposition is. All right, we're all done with the setup. Now it's time to talk about these 10 propositions. Now, I could just go in numerical order, but I have chapters with the names of the propositions, and I'd rather do it this way. I'd rather start with the least controversial ones, in my opinion. I'll explain why they are or aren't controversial in the red flag section. But I'm going to start with the least controversial, go all the way to the most controversial. So it's kind of easy to skip to that part. These early ones are going to be relatively quick, except for the bond ones, because I got to go through. I want to go through and tell you what the money's for. And it's lined item actually in here. So you're going to, each of them has like 7 or 8 line items. But I want to start least controversial to most controversial. So buckle up, let's get going. Proposition 3. Proposition 3 establishes the right of every Californian to marry any other person regardless of sexual orientation. Specifically, it removes the language of defining marriage as between a man and a woman from the California Constitution. This was a legislatively referred constitutional amendment to the California Constitution. This proposition specifically repeals Prop 8, which I believe was passed in the 1990s, which added that language of defining a marriage being between a man and a woman into the California Constitution, again, back when California was a little bit redder. And also, the gay marriage issue was a little more controversial than it is now. Are there any red flags? Not really. If you look at the legislative vote, there were actually no votes in the legislature in either house. There were a bunch of absences where Republicans, I think one Democrat, but almost all Republicans didn't vote. But it actually got 10 Republican votes. So there's nothing funky about the language or any reason to believe there's some poison pill in it or anything like that. The other thing you should know about this, and I kind of just put it here in red flags, where else am I going to put it, is that Proposition 8 was already invalidated by the United States Supreme Court back in 2015. So this proposition doesn't materially change anything in California. And the LAO said so. The Legislative Analyst's Office said as much. I think it's just being done because right now in the California Constitution, there is anti-gay language. And so I think that desire is just to remove that as kind of a relic of not too distant history, but a relic of history from the law, which I generally support because I hate when you find out, oh, there's some law from 1860 nobody bothered to remove from the law. You want to get rid of stuff once it's no longer reflects the current populace's opinions about that issue. And I think this is kind of a mostly settled matter. So how should you decide? Well, as I said, there's no real consequence to voting either way. So I think this is one of those ones that's simple enough to just vote your conscience. If you feel any type of way about it for whatever reason, maybe your personal or religious convictions, just vote against it. It won't hurt anybody. But if you're for it, you vote for it. If you're against it, you vote against it. So this is one of those easy ones where you can just kind of vote your conscience and not worry about any consequences to it. Me personally, I'll be voting for it because that's how I feel about it. Next we have Proposition 6. Proposition 6 removes involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime from the California State Constitution. This is a legislatively referred constitutional amendment to the California Constitution. The California Constitution currently allows involuntary servitude, making people work as part of a punishment for crimes in California. And it also allows for people to be punished if they don't do the work that's assigned to them. So they could lose things like in the LAO, the analyst, the voter guide, it says that, phone privileges are an example of something you can lose if you don't do the work that's mandated to you under this. Now, there are people that prisoners that work and get paid low salaries for doing things, but oftentimes they're kind of mandated to do those things. Now, they'd be purely doing it because they're choosing to work and do it. They can choose not to work if they don't want to. According to the Legislative Analyst's Office, the cost of passing this proposition is very unclear. The LAO even goes as far as to say it's not sure if it would cost more money or actually save money. I personally suspect it would cost a little more money because now the prisoners don't have to work to, work the kitchen or the laundry or what have you in the prison. They don't have to do that. Then you're going to have to pay people more, to pay the prisoners more in order to have them do those jobs. Like the incentive, we have to increase the incentive because there's no negative incentive anymore to not doing them. This proposition was another that was put on the ballot by the California legislature. So how did they vote on it? Well, there were 3 no votes, a whopping 3 no votes. There were 15 absentee votes, but 8 Republicans did vote yes. So there seemed to be at least some bipartisan support. Also, in the California Voters Guide, no rebuttal to the affirmative argument nor an affirmative argument against were submitted. So how should you decide this? Well, essentially the question is, how do you feel about prisoners being forced to do work for kind of poverty wages? If you are okay with that, or you want them as part of the punishment to have to do that work, then you would vote against this. If you're uncomfortable with it or think they should be paid, you would vote for it. Now, as for me, I'm kind of philosophically against it. I do think it's a form of kind of slavery. Obviously, I understand the idea of punishing people by making them work, but I actually think it'd be a good idea for prisoners, in order to actually prevent recidivism, to let them make a little bit of money, more than the measly amount they make now, in order to help them stay out of prison once they're done with their terms. I think that giving them the opportunity to work, but with real wages and not slave wages, I think makes a difference. So I'm in favor of for both philosophical reason, as well as for the reason of thinking it actually would be a net positive for our society. Proposition 2 authorizes the issuing of $10 billion in California bonds for the fund construction and modernization of public education facilities. It is a legislative proposition, meaning a vote in the legislature put it on the California ballot. Let's get into the details. How is that $10 billion broken up? It's not just one big giant chunk. They've got different parts of it that are earmarked for different components of modernizing and fixing schools. $3 billion is for new construction of school facilities, with up to 10% available for small school districts. I couldn't quite find out what that meant. I think it just means to make sure there's not an exclusion of smaller municipalities from this. $4 billion for the modernization of school facilities. But this includes $115 million for lead and water testing and remediation. $600 million, those are the two big ones. That's $7 billion right there. $600 million for charter school facilities. $600 million for career technical education program facilities. That's like, learning a trade, that type of thing. And $1.5 billion for California community colleges. The overall cost is, as for the overall cost, what we're talking about is $10 billion repaid over 35 years. That nets or calculates to a yearly payment, kind of an amortization, a yearly payment over those 35 years of $500 million per year. Adding that to the $6 billion we have now, we already pay for the bond debt that California currently has, that increases the California bond repayment line item in kind of the general fund from $6 billion to $6.5 billion. And just as a reminder, that $6 or $6.5 billion represents around 3 to 3.25% of the total general fund expenditures every year, which is about $200 billion. This was passed by the legislature, so let's take a look at that vote. It was overwhelmingly passed with 14 Republicans actually voting yes on it, 4 no votes, and 9 not voting. So pretty strong support, more than slightly bipartisan. The main complaint that I see for bond propositions in general is that we're issuing bonds or debt rather than just adding them as a line item to our budget. Why are we doing that? And I think there are 2 reasons. The first reason is that you can get more money right away. So you can issue $10 billion in bonds and start paying it off at a cost of just $500 million a year. And you have the better part of that $10 billion, quote unquote, right away. Like not exactly right away, but pretty close to right away. If you line item $500 million into the budget, you have access to $500 million. So it's not quite the same. So you have access to a different amount of money, a larger amount of money initially, having to pay it back. I mean, that's kind of why you take out loans to buy cars and homes. You don't have the money on you. You can't just tell somebody, I'd like to buy your house. I'll pay you $2,000 or $3,000 a month, but you give me the house now. They're going to say, no, we need all the money now. And then you can pay back them. So the idea is with things that are in propositions, you want to have paid them now. You need to pay them now and you pay it back later. Line items are for things that you only need a little bit of money and you can just afford to just pay it. I don't think California has $10 billion laying around to put into this over the next 2 or 3 years even. That's, again, 35 years, or you could pay that's, 20 years to do that via just $500 million per. So that's the difference. The other reason is because when you want to do large programs, you don't want to start it and stop it. You want to authorize what you need so that you have what you need. And if the winds of politics change 2 years from now, you don't have half-built buildings or half-complete tasks or whatever this is allocated for. I think that's the other reason, is that you have a task to do. You want to get all the money for the task set in place before you start it. You don't want to start it not knowing where the rest of the money is coming from. You put it in the budget, you don't know where the rest of the money is coming from. It might be there for the budget next year. It might not. Depends on how negotiations go. Who says what? Who gets elected? Who gets kicked out of office? All the politics and stuff. You want to get, if this is something you feel is important enough, you put it forward and you get it set in place, and then the politics are kind of out of it. I think that's the other reason. But it's a good question. One issue specific to this proposition that was raised, I thought was interesting and worth talking about, is that there's a matching funds requirement for some of this, for local communities. So if you want the California government, to help fix your school, you got to put in too. And what that might lead to is taxes being raised, local taxes being raised, probably property taxes, because that's how most municipalities raise money for schools in order to pay their share of the new school building or the school repair or what have you. And because of that, someone's concerned enough about their property taxes going up at all even a small amount, they may vote against that. And I think that's understandable. I wanted to bring that up too because I think that's a valid concern for this proposition. That brings us right to how to decide. I think that the main concern here for Californians is twofold. One, is this worth the $10 billion we're going to spend for it? Is this rise to the level of something that is a big project that should be done, that we should fund with bond debt? The second part is whether or not you're comfortable with the risk that your community may raise taxes in order to help do their share of paying for this. Those, I think, are your two concerns and what you should probably be weighing when deciding whether or not to vote for this. For me, I think I'm going to vote for it. There's another proposition that's also $10 billion that I'm thinking about too. And so I could see maybe voting for both of them, but I might just vote for one of them. And then it's okay, which one do I vote for? So there's something for me. So I'm honestly not 100% sure. I think I'm voting for it because education is super important. And so I'm not going to lie and tell you that I'm 50-50. I'm not. I'm probably going to vote for it. Although it is still a lot of money. It's a, over 10% increase of California's current debt load. So it's far from nothing. So that's something that I'm having to weigh and consider. But I think so because I think maintaining our schools is really important. And education is where we should be spending our money. And there can be other propositions this year that are for spending money for other things. And so you kind of look at that in contrast and think, where do I want to spend California's money and my share of the tax money? And I think it's more so to education and things of this sort. Proposition 4 authorizes the issuance of $10 billion in California bonds to fund state and local parks, environmental protection projects, water infrastructure projects, energy projects, and flood protection projects. This was a legislative proposition, meaning the California legislature passed it to put it on this ballot for November. So how does this $10 billion break down? Well, $3.8 billion, a huge chunk of it, goes to increase the amount and quality of water available for people to use and separately reduce the risk of flooding. So they kind of mash two very different things together for that allocation of $3.8 billion, but just want to explain that to you. $1.5 billion to improve the health of forests and protect communities from forest fires. $1.2 billion to reduce the risk from sea level rise, restore coastal areas, and protect fish. $1.2 billion to protect and restore natural areas. Wow, is that vague? $850 million to support the state's shift to more renewable resources of energy, such as offshore wind. $700 million to expand, renovate, and repair local and state parks. And $450 million to reduce the effects of extreme heat on communities. I don't know exactly what that means though, but that's what it says in the voter guide. The overall cost of this proposition is $10 billion to be paid back over 40 years at $400 million per year. The current California state general fund payment to repay its outstanding bonds is $6 billion. This would add $400 million to that, increasing the cost of the general bond, the California bond repayment from 3 to about 3.2%. Because the general fund overall is, again, $200 billion. So it's small, but not nothing. And we got a lot of money here in California, but this certainly adds a notable little bit to our bond repayment, our yearly bond repayment. The legislative vote that put this proposition on the ballot was somewhat bipartisan. There were 7 Republicans voting yes, 11 total no votes, and 9 non-votes. So there were some Republicans crossing over, maybe a third of them, but a lot certainly voting no. The same objection that I mentioned for Proposition 2 about using California bonds and issuing debt rather than simply adding a line item to the budget remains. It's the same type of issue, and you have to ask yourself, is this a good issue that's worth setting aside that big chunk of money and paying back that interest with interest over the course of time? So how do you decide whether or not to vote for it? Like Proposition 2, it's a question about cost versus, what you're getting for that cost. Do you want to set aside this $10 billion for these projects or these types of projects, these issues that are facing California? If you're not sure about it, as I said with my general guidelines, vote no. You don't want to feel pushed or pressured into doing things. They can add line items. They can address minor individual things separately. You shouldn't feel like this is the only way we can pay for these things. This is whether or not you want to actually create, kind of set aside this money if it's a priority for you, I think. Me, I think I'll be voting for it. I think these things are a priority. I'm not as worried about the current debt load of California, though if I vote for both of these, and the other one I'm kind of considering one or the other or both, but if I vote for these propositions, I'm gonna remember this and be very stingy when it comes to propositions in the future, because we are getting to the point where that you don't want that debt load, that yearly debt to get over $10 billion. I think we're inching it up every little bit. We passed something I think 2 years ago that was 10 billion or 5 billion. So it's inching up. It's at 80 billion with 35 more authorized to be issued. So it could be, even if we don't pass anything else, it could be at 115. So for that reason, I think that we want to seriously consider each time we authorize more bonds. Okay, so those were kind of the easy ones. Now we're getting to the ones that get a little bit more messy and complicated. So bear with me. Proposition 35. Proposition 35 permanently authorizes an existing tax on managed care organizations to fund Medi-Cal programs. So there's a tax now that's applied to healthcare organizations that's temporary. And this proposition would make it permanent and would allocate that money in a specific way. We'll talk more about that in a minute. This is a quote-unquote citizen-initiated state statute, meaning it was not passed through the legislature. It was passed by private entities. Who were those private entities? Well, let me tell you. The California Hospitals Committee on Issues, along with the Global Medical Response, Inc. and California Medical Association, collectively raised $50 million in support of this proposition, meaning you've probably seen commercials for it. I think I saw one with a black woman that was like, either she was a nurse or she's playing a nurse, but they put a lot of money into this. These are essentially Medi-Cal providers that paid for this proposition to be on the ballot. And there's no real strong organized entity against. The Legislative Analyst's Office estimates the total cost of passing this proposition to be between $1 and $2 billion. Now you might ask, why does this proposition cost money? We're making a tax permanent. That's the thing. It makes the tax permanent, but it also mandates that the revenue from that tax go to specific places, taking it away from other places. And I'll go in a minute, go into details how those change. But some of those things are things that California will probably have to replace that spending from the general fund. In addition, just this process of doing this apparently has some cost associated with it, according to the LAO. So that's the issue, is we're not just keeping a tax. That'd be simple. We're keeping a tax and we are mandating that tax be used, the revenue from that tax be used, allocated in certain ways. Let me go to the voter's guide and kind of go down briefly what those changes are. Let me correct myself. The annual cost would be between $1 and $2 billion for 2025 and 2026, which are the 2 years where this tax is definitely going to happen. After 2027, the LAO isn't comfortable making any kind of estimation as to how much this is going to cost per year. It could continue to cost $1 to $2 billion, could cost more, could cost less. There's also this issue the federal government has to approve this tax. So even though California is making it permanent, the federal government has a veto power on it. So it might not even go into effect. We could vote yes on it and the federal government says no. For me, it'd be safe to say that assuming the tax is approved by the federal government, there's going to continue to be some cost in at least the hundreds of millions of dollars for doing this. And why is that? Because again, they're changing what money is allocated where and taking away from some places that California needs to be funded somehow, which means that money has to come out of the general fund. So here's a chart on the voter's guide, it's page 35, the chart of what services are get money and are defunded by Proposition 35. Proposition 35 takes away funding from the following services: non-emergency medical transportation, private duty nursing, certain long-term supports, community health workers, though there's some possible way to maybe get funding. There's a little note at the bottom about maybe you could get it. And then continuous Medi-Cal coverage for children up to 5 years old. That's a big one. And what's added? Specified hospital services. Interesting. Outpatient facilities and behavioral health facilities. So you can see these are things we can't just not have as Californians. Money will have to come from somewhere else, and it's being taken away from those things, well, the first set of things, by Proposition 35. It's interesting. For me, this has several red flags, as I'm pointing out to you. But in the voter's guide, there actually is no rebuttal against the argument for. There's no argument against. So nobody's sticking their chest out to be against this. That's why sometimes, you got to look at things for yourself, because as you can see, there are definitely some red flags here, but officially nobody's piping up. No politicians, no organizations are saying no to this. Probably because they want the tax to be continued, and this is doing that. But as I mentioned earlier, this proposition isn't free. It allocates basically more money to hospitals and takes it away from some other places where I think California will have to spend money in the general fund. Also, I kind of have a thing where I'm just against letting corporations write California law. I just think that's a bad idea in general. And clearly this is California hospital corporations writing law, just like Uber and Lyft wrote law in 2020. Gets me nervous. There's no real vetting. Legislature didn't look at this. It's just what they wanted to do. There's also the issue of the tax not being necessarily even going forward. This thing will get invalidated if the federal government says no. So it's a whole lot of maybes going on here too. It seems like this is temporary for a reason, because we can't depend on it as something that we can definitely do. So now we're codifying something when we can't even really codify it. We're pretending to, hoping the federal government approves. So how should you decide on this? Well, the question is, what I've told you, does it worry you? Do you worry about that $1 to $2 billion per year that California may have to spend so that Medi-Cal, that tax can go to Medi-Cal vendors like hospitals? Or do you want to leave things the way they are? I think that's the basic question here. Again, I have the principal issue of having corporations write California law, but aside from that, that's the basic question. For me, I'm voting no. I don't think this is necessary. It seems essentially extraneous. The hospitals, they want to get more Medi-Cal money, and so they're passing this to assure themselves of more revenue, which corporations always like doing that, and passing something that may not actually have any effect. But if it does, they get more money. For me, that's a no thanks. All right, now we're on to our last legislative proposition. Proposition 5 lowers the vote threshold from 2/3 to 55% for local bond measures to fund housing projects and public infrastructure. This was a legislatively referred constitutional amendment. It has to be, the legislature voted on this to give it to us to amend our Constitution. It had to be done because the existing law, which it overturns, is in the California Constitution. It's pretty straightforward what this does. This allows local communities to more easily pass bond measures, this is counties, cities, to pass bond measures, basically issue their own debt at that level in order to raise money specifically for issues related to building housing and maintaining infrastructure, even things like fire protection stuff, like prevent buildings from burning down or what have you. So it's all kinds of things like that. They can raise money for more easily. Instead of being 2/3 vote, it's only 55%. I think it's very interesting that that's in the California Constitution, that they need a 66% vote to issue bonds. That seems really high, but I can only think that's because they don't want local communities to go too easily into debt, because ultimately the state will have to be there to rescue them if they default, which communities sometimes do default on debt. That happens. And the state or the federal government has to bail them out. But hold on, there's one other thing that this does. I almost missed it, but I did catch this little wrinkle that it adds as well. It's not just about bonds, even though the headline is about lowering this voting threshold to issue bonds. It's not just that. There's also a provision that it allows up to a 1% increase in property taxes assessed by local government for the same purpose. So this could cause your property taxes to go up, apparently. In the overall cost section, the Legislative Analyst's Office essentially says, well, more bonds are likely to be issued by local communities. That has an interest cost, of course. Property taxes could go up. I actually think the bonds are more likely because they're a little politically safer than raising property taxes. People get real pissed about that. So if you're a local community and you vote to raise your property taxes, people might come for your head. So I think it's much more likely they're going to go for the bonds and do the property taxes. In fact, this might make the property taxes less likely because they don't have to do that now. They can get money through bonds more easily, and they may want to do that. The legislative vote that put this proposition on the ballot was very partisan. There were 22 no votes and 14 abstainings and 0 Republican votes. And I think a few Democrats might have voted against it, like 1 or 2. So very partisan. So how should you vote on it? Well, I think this comes down to how much you trust your local government. If you think that, and or how important you think this issue is to allow your local government to address these issues. Like if you think the issue is really important, then you want your government to have more power to be able to do something about it, like raise money for more housing. If you don't think it's a big issue, then you definitely don't want to pass this. If you think it's a big issue, but you don't trust your government, you probably still don't want to pass this. You want to elect some different people first. So I think that's what it comes down to, is how important is this issue to you in your local community, and whether or not you trust your local government to make the right decision when it comes to property taxes and it comes to issuing bonds or authorizing the issuing of bonds. I think I'm going to vote yes on it because I think the issue is important enough to me. Lack of housing is a huge problem in California. It's a problem where I live in Pasadena. I think it's a problem all across California. So even though I understand why we have the requirement of 66% in general for bond issuing for local communities, because some aren't that responsible, I think my government, at least my local government's pretty responsible, and I kind of hope they do this. I think we need bond money, big chunks of bond money, to build housing affordable. I see housing going up that's not affordable, but affordable housing for people to address the issue of lack of housing in California. And I know anytime we try to fix housing, it's going to lower our housing values. I get that, but I have to live in my house. I'm not selling it. I want to have a community where people who need a place to live, who are working in my community, have a place to live. If that means my house isn't quite as valuable as it already is, then so be it. But again, that's how I come down on it. That's what you have to decide for yourself, is weigh the issue against the consequences. Proposition 32, simply put, slightly raises the California minimum wage to $18 by 2026. This proposition is a citizen-initiated state statute that was actually initiated by a single citizen. His name is Joseph N. Sandberg. He is a very rich man with progressive politics and, I think, political ambition. And he funded getting this proposition on the ballot to the tune of about $11.4 million. Again, about the minimum you need to get a proposition on the ballot is around $10 million. So he put in enough, but he didn't blow up the spot. So you probably won't see any commercials, or not that many of them, with him talking about passing it. I think putting it on there and getting it on the ballot was probably the goal. Though I could see it passing. I don't think he's worried about that. The way the LAO describes the effect of this proposition fiscally is essentially a minor one. A minor increase in wages, minor decrease perhaps in corporate profits, and a minor decrease perhaps in number of available jobs. Essentially a minor effect for a minor adjustment to California's minimum wage. If you go into the details, it doesn't really change very much. You see, California has already done two things. It's already raised the current minimum wage to $16.50, and this only raises it to $17 at the beginning of next year. We've already raised the minimum wage of specific workers, like people who work at fast food, to $20 or $21, already well above this. We already index for inflation. This proposition actually freezes the increase on inflation for 2 years because it mandates $17 then $18 over the next 2 years and then reactivates it. A slight correction before I go. So our current minimum wage is $16 per hour. The LAO estimates that that will be $16.50 by next year due to inflation. And he doesn't go any further, but that kind of means it'll probably be almost 17 by 2026. Also, the way this proposition works is it has it progresses to $18 slower if you're a smaller business under 25 people. It does it $17 2025, $18 2026. If you're a bigger company, it goes right to $18 next year for 2025. So it is it's a $1.50 increase for people working in bigger companies, unless, of course, they already have a bigger wage from other California laws. So how should you vote on this? Well, I think you should just vote no because it's not worth bothering. And it actually adds more complexity to the California law when it comes to this. But if you really want to give people an extra 50 cents going into 2027 and an extra dollar, 2025, and an extra dollar going into 2028, then 2026, then you could do it. I wouldn't bother. I'm voting no. And I think it's kind of an ego stroke, and I kind of don't like the smell of it. It seems like he's doing it now because he really needs to be done. I feel like he could have spent that $12 million on something much more worthwhile than a slight increase to our minimum wage for non-fast food workers because they already are paid more than that. Proposition 33 repeals parts of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Act of 1995, which itself prevents cities and counties from limiting initial and incremental rent rates of tenants under certain circumstances. What that means in layman's terms is the California state government doesn't let counties and cities have stronger rent control than the state mandates. The state has its rules for rent control, and it doesn't let smaller municipalities within the state from doing additional rules. Now, if some particular municipality has issues in particular with rent control, they're just out of luck, or issues with rents going up too fast. They're just out of luck under the current law. What Prop 33 does is allow local cities or counties to have stronger rent control rules than Costa-Hawkins, which honestly isn't that strong. This is a quote-unquote citizen-initiated state statute, which is actually financially backed primarily by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is actually a global organization, but it's located here in Los Angeles. Perhaps that's why they got involved as much as they are in California politics. They spent about $40 million, or they've invested about $40 million into getting this proposition passed. And in the other corner, in opposition, is the California Apartment Association, the California Association of Realtors, and the National Association of Realtors. They have collectively raised about $66 million in opposition. And for example, if you look at that commercial with Gavin Newsom, touting essentially the update to Costa-Hawkins from a few years ago, that's paid for by them. And that's why they're flooding the airwaves, because they're spending a boatload of money to try to beat this. Because if this goes into law, as the Legislative Analyst Office says, this will cause housing to not either increase in value as much or decrease in value perhaps. Because if you can't increase rents as fast as you currently can, especially on new construction, which Costa-Hawkins mostly says you can't do any rent control on. If it's built after 1995, you can't really do rent control on much of anything that's built after 1995. If you do that, if you take that away in a local area like, say, Los Angeles decides to, say, put in rent control, suddenly you can't, the future prospects of profit are smaller on those properties, and that lowers their value. It also can affect property taxes, decrease the revenues because property is not continuing to fly up in value. The property taxes aren't going to continue to fly up in value. And so over the long term, property taxes, they'll still probably go up, but they'll kind of level off more. They won't go up as fast as they've been going up over the last 10, 20 years. This proposition also limits the ability of the state government to try to override the proposition and repass rent control laws that kind of undo this proposition. Jumping into red flags, as those commercials are pointing out, there was a recent statewide update to the laws that govern rent control in California. But let me give you the headlines for it. First, all it does is cap rental increases to 10% a year. So if you're paying $2,000, your rent can be raised up to $200 if inflation is high enough. So you can raise it up to 5 just on the humble, as much as you want. You can raise up to another 5% based on what inflation is. So if inflation's 5% and you want to raise it 5, you can raise it 10. So you can do that. And as I just mentioned, for new construction after 1995, you can't. There's no rent control. They can set the initial rates of rent much as they want, and that's true regardless. There's no rent control in initial rates. If you start renting something from nowhere, there's no existing tenant, even before 1995, you can set the price wherever you want. Once somebody's there, then if it's pre-1995 construction, then it kicks in. Also, I believe if it's a single family home, you can't do any rent control. So you can rent, single family homes are totally exempt from California rent control. 1995 post builds, totally exempt from rent control. Initial tenants, totally exempt from rent control. It's only after they start re-upping that you can limit how much you can increase it. So it's extremely limited. So the idea that there's some great rent control system in California that we must maintain and protect and not hurt it with this proposition is hogwash. Certainly, there's a reasonable argument for increased rent control in certain communities where there's a huge amount of demand for housing and prices are continuing to blow. I think somewhere I was renting 10 years ago, I think double the rent now than it was then, something like that. It's insane. I'm in Pasadena. It's crazy. I think the idea that what California did, it's solved. Gavin Newsom solved it, and the Democrats in Sacramento solved it. I think is ridiculous. But that's what they're talking about. So how should you vote on it? I mean, here's the thing. If you're going to sell your house soon, I get it. You got to worry about housing prices being affected by this. And they probably will be, at least to some extent. But if you're not, if you're someone like me who's going to probably live in my house another 15 years, it's not going to affect me. And I see the crazy rents. I see, the homelessness. And we've got to, it's probably the biggest issue in California. The biggest one issue in California probably is housing. We need to build more, and we've got to do something about these rents in the short term, because building takes time. Rent control allows you to address it in the short term. And it's funny how conservatives love to be so for local control, except when it comes to the money. Then they want the state to control it and not let local communities do what they want. But I think in this case, this should be local, because housing prices might be fine in Riverside, right? They might be fine in Sacramento, but they might be really bad in San Diego or in Los Angeles. This is too regional. There shouldn't be really much rules for rent control, but they shouldn't prohibit the local communities from doing what they want to do. So that's what you have to consider. Its real only negative effect is, possible decreases in property values if rent control, if it's initiated in your area, because it may not be. If your local if your local government is fairly conservative, they won't, right? Even if it's not, if they're depending on, if they're just centrist, they probably won't. But it's an option for communities that have this problem that want to solve it. And I'm voting for it. I want them to have the option of doing it. And I just don't really see much of a downside. Again, unless you're about to sell your house. Why would you care as a private citizen if a government helps keep rent knocking people out of? Because that's what happens. As rent goes up too fast, people get evicted. That's what rent control tries to prevent, is evictions, to keep it from getting worse. Because what we're seeing is it's getting worse. Demand continues to drop and things just get worse. So I think that's what this wants to do, and why I think we should allow local government to have a say. Proposition 34 says it does two things, but really only does one. It says it permanently authorizes California to negotiate Medi-Cal prices on a statewide basis. But it already does that. It also says it requires a very small set of healthcare providers to spend 98% of revenues from the federal discount prescription drug program on direct patient care. This is a citizen-initiated state statute paid for by, wait for it, the California Apartment Association. That sounds familiar. They spent $30 million to put this proposition about Medi-Cal on the California ballot. And opposition is, this might be figuring out what's going on here, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. They spend about $1 million in trying to fight it, but not really that much. As I mentioned already, California already negotiates drug prices for Medi-Cal and something called Medi-Cal RX. The official voters information guide says as much. What it can say is what I'm going to say, which is this is a scam proposition. This is a proposition the California Apartments Association put on the ballot as a counterattack, as a reprisal for Prop 33. It puts the Medi-Cal authorization, which it isn't officially in law, that's true, but it doesn't need to be in law. It's like passing a proposition and say you have to paint the lines on the street yellow when they're already yellow. Who knows there's actually a statute that makes you do it, but we do it because it makes sense. But what it really does is that other thing. It has this 98% requirement of revenues from federally discounted prescription drug program go to direct patient care. Why 98%? I don't know. But here's the thing. This doesn't make everybody that gets revenue from federally discounted prescription drug program to spend that on direct patient care. It doesn't do that. It makes a very small subset do that. Let's look at the requirements of that subset. Here's a nice voter guide right here. And this is Prop 34. Let's go right to 34. Restrictions only if these conditions are met. They must participate in the federal drug discount program. They have or have ever had a license in California to operate a health plan, pharmacy, or clinic, or has had certain contracts with Medicare or Medicaid. If they ever have, why would you have a requirement from something in the past if they're not doing it now? Why would it matter what they did 20 years ago? 3, has a 10-year period, okay, where it spent more than $100 million on purposes other than direct patient care. So organizations that spend a whole bunch of money on non-direct patient care have to spend it on all their money on direct patient care. And then 4th, owns and operates or has previously owned and operated multifamily housing units with at least 500 violations with a severity level of high. What does owning and operating multifamily housing have to do with how you spend the revenue from from the federal drug discount program? The answer is nothing. These requirements, and it's funny because the LAO kind of says, we're not sure who actually falls under these. And one of their costs is the cost of the what do you call those people? The bureaucracy to figure out who to actually charge, and there's a whole bunch of really horrible penalties if you violate this, of course. But this is reprisal. We want to hurt the AIDS Global Foundation for trying to pass more local rent control, allowing local communities to have rent control if they want to. For doing that, we want to send the California government after you about what we think is stuff that, so in a way that might harm you. The way they can pass kind of, if you glance at it, it kind of looks like, oh, you probably should be spending that money on something important. But it's revenge. And it's weaponizing the California proposition system in order to use it against your political or legislative enemies. So that's what this proposition is. And the sad thing is the early polling on it was kind of good because all they're talking about is Medi-Cal permanent authorization. We're going to put in the law the Medi-Cal negotiating drug prices, something that like Bernie Sanders was talking about 10 years ago or 8 years ago. They're like, we're going to do it. California already does it. They got the lady on television. This is so great that finally we're going to be able to negotiate the... It's ridiculous. It's just a hustle. It's a scam. So, how should you vote? Well, if you would like to hurt the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, if you would like California Apartment Association to weaponize our proposition system for their own gains, then vote for it, I guess. Otherwise, vote against it. This is the type of stuff that shouldn't be on our ballots. And it's a shame to me that this kind of thing, I don't hear anybody talking about it. And it's a terrible misuse of the commons, of a direct democracy system, which I think in general is a good thing. But this is what money in politics does. It causes this kind of garbage in our ballots. And this is even the only one that I think is kind of corporate misuse of a proposition system. But this is the worst use of it. I'll be voting against it with aplomb. And finally, Proposition 36. Proposition 36 increases penalties for certain drug crimes and theft convictions and allows a new class of crime called treatment mandated felonies. I'll explain what that all means in a minute. This is a citizen, quote unquote, citizen initiated state statute that was paid for by Walmart, Target, and Home Depot. According to this, they've raised about $12 million to get this on the ballot. And it's opposed by, honestly, a few rich people, probably progressive, put together some money to try to fight it a little bit. So what does this do? Well, in part it repeals Prop 47, which was passed not long ago, and that actually lowered theft and drug crimes to misdemeanors. This was only back, I think, in 2014. Lowered those to misdemeanors. Because the thing is, if something's a felony, it's much more likely you have to spend time either in county jail or prison. So you lower things to misdemeanors, it means fewer people in the penitentiary, right? This reverses that. This says, no, if you steal from Target 3 times, no matter how little it is, we can charge you for a felony. It's the third time. So if you basically if you steal something small 3 times, theoretically, by law, you can be charged with a felony for that third one. That's probably the most egregious thing about this. The other part is, and it's funny because this is Target. I was surprised when I saw this. Target, Walmart's the biggest one. Walmart, Target, and Home Depot are the funders. Like, why are they even putting stuff in about drug crimes in here? The reason is they want to help it pass. They're trying to basically combine groups. So if you're worried about fentanyl or heroin, or if you're worried about snatch and grabs, we've got the proposition just for you. That's, I think, what they're going for. They're trying to merge those together to kind of create 2 groups to get a majority. But what they're doing is they're going to end up putting more people in prison. They do have an out for, now they make even the crime of possessing drugs, they try to turn that into a felony. But if you plead guilty and do mandated drug treatment, which of course California pays for, then you won't go to prison. So there's an out if you plead guilty. Now, never mind if you don't plead guilty, if you actually claim you're innocent and go to trial, which very few drug possession people do that. But most people plead out because nobody has any money for lawyers that are drug users. But if you do it, so really what that becomes is a whole bunch of people put into these giant farming of mandated drug programs, which I think is good to spend money on drug programs. But why don't we just have a optional drug program that people don't have to be found guilty of a crime to go to, rather than, okay, we're going to turn it back into felonies, and if you don't plead guilty, then you're going to prison for using crack, or you can plead guilty and then go to this place for a certain amount of time we're making you go. That's what they're doing. That's not quite as cruel, I think, as the theft one, which I think is totally ridiculous. But that's the kind of the drug side of it. So there is a cost to all this. It isn't free. Putting all these people in prison, creating this new judicial framework for treatment mandated felonies is not free. In fact, it will cost hundreds of millions of dollars to California every single year, according to the Legislative Analyst Office. They say in the low hundreds of millions, so maybe 1 to 200 million. But again, not free. It really seems like the writers of this proposition are playing on the press about retail crime, which really was a reaction to coming out of COVID. It went back up because everybody was at home. Nobody's snatching necklaces from a jeweler. Everybody's at home. And then drug stuff, which we still haven't fixed yet, which I think education is how you solve the drug problem, not prison. But that's my opinion. But it's a reaction to the fentanyl news primarily, as well as the retail theft. To me, it's sensationalism of the media. And that's what this is kind of playing on, in my opinion. And as I mentioned before, it seems kind of odd to me to have Walmart, Target, and Home Depot writing California criminal law. Doesn't seem like a good idea to me. So how should you decide how to vote on this? Well, If you really are worried about retail crime, you think we need to send more people to prison for it, and we need to go more after drug users and drug dealers and send more of them to prison or make them go to treatment, that's what this bill does. If you think it's about education, if you think retail crime is kind of press sensationalism mostly, and it's the same as it was factually before the pandemic, and you think the drug problem is the one you solve with education, not with the judicial system, then this isn't the bill for the proposition for you. So I'll be voting no on it. It's kind of made it obvious how I feel about it. That's why I put this one last, because I have strong feelings about it, because we as Americans put more people in jail than almost anybody in the world, I think, except for China. We try to solve our problems with prisons, and whenever I see something like this, the bar is high for me, because we're already in this system. We're already doing this. We need to try other stuff, and I'm looking forward to propositions for that, not propositions written by Walmart to send people to prison. I don't like that. Just saying it just sounds bad to me. So I'm voting no. And we made it. That's quite a cut there, probably. Thank you for watching this video. Please like it so it gets out and people hear about these propositions, so people can vote with some information. If nothing, take nothing else from it, read the voter's guide. The information is right there for you. Also, if you like Fight for Democracy, you like me, please subscribe. I'll have my links down. You can hit the subscribe button. I got a link to a newsletter that I just kind of send out my new videos with. I'm just getting it started right now. You can get involved in that. Leave a comment if you'd like to. Just tell me thanks. I appreciate it. This channel I haven't done a whole lot with, because politics, honestly, I do kind of real life politics stuff. So I kind of do a movie one for fun, a movie YouTube thing for fun. This kind of takes more work and more energy, and I'd rather put that towards kind of the grassroots stuff I do in real life. But these propositions are important. People tell me, oh, I watch your videos, they really help me, so I wanted to put this out and get the information out there. So thanks for watching, and thanks if you are a subscriber. Thanks for subscribing. I still appreciate that. I want to do more going forward, but I'm still trying to figure out the best way to kind of do political YouTube, because I don't want to do it like I see a lot of other people doing it, very reactionary. So I'm still kind of thinking about that, but this channel is still valued to me, and I'm still hoping to grow it maybe a little bit with this video, but as long as people watch it, that's the important thing. So thanks for watching, and thanks for doing your civic duty and voting in this November's election.